Sarah Mitchell had been awake for nearly 22 hours when she finally locked the door of her small studio apartment behind her. Her 6-year-old daughter Maya was already at the neighbour's place, dropped off at 5 in the morning before Sarah's double shift at St. Mary's Hospital began. She worked as a nursing assistant, a job that paid barely enough to cover rent and groceries. But it was honest work, and she was good at it. The problem was that being good at it wasn't always enough when life kept throwing obstacles in her path. She was 3 blocks from the bus stop when she saw him. A man in an expensive-looking suit was slumped against a building wall, one hand pressed against his side, his face pale and drawn with pain. Most people were hurrying past him without a second glance, probably assuming he was drunk or homeless, despite the obvious quality of his clothing. Sarah knew better. She'd seen enough medical emergencies to recognize someone in real distress. She stopped, crouching down beside him. The man looked up at her with glazed eyes. She could see he was trying to focus, trying to speak, but the words weren't coming. His breathing was shallow and rapid. She gently moved his hand away from his side and saw the blood seeping through his white shirt. Not a lot, but enough to be concerning. Her mind immediately started running through possibilities. Stab wound, maybe, or some kind of penetrating injury. She pulled out her phone and called for an ambulance, giving the dispatcher their location and a quick assessment of his condition. Then she took off her jacket and pressed it against his side to slow the bleeding. The man's eyes met hers, and she saw recognition there, an awareness that she was helping him. He tried to say something again, but she shook her head gently. She told him not to try to talk. That help was coming, that he was going to be okay. She kept her voice calm and steady, the way she'd learned to do at work when patients were scared. The ambulance arrived within 8 minutes. She gave the paramedics a quick rundown of what she'd found and how long she'd been with him. They thanked her and loaded him onto a stretcher. As they were closing the ambulance doors, the man looked back at her one more time. His lips moved, forming what might have been "thank you," but she couldn't be sure. Then the doors shut, and the ambulance pulled away, siren wailing as it disappeared into morning traffic. Sarah stood there for a moment, suddenly aware that her hands were shaking and her jacket was ruined. She checked the time on her phone, and her stomach dropped. She'd missed 2 buses. She was going to be late for her shift at Riverside Care Centre, the nursing home where she worked her second job. She started running toward the bus stop, knowing it was probably futile but unable to stop herself from trying. She arrived at Riverside 43 minutes late. Her supervisor, Mrs. Chen, was waiting for her at the entrance, arms crossed, expression tight with disapproval. Sarah tried to explain what had happened, the words tumbling out quickly as she showed her ruined jacket as proof, but Mrs. Chen cut her off. She'd heard enough excuses, she said. This was the 3rd time Sarah had been late in 2 months. It didn't matter that the other times had been because Maya was sick and the school had called her to pick her up. It didn't matter that Sarah had worked every extra shift she'd been asked to cover. Company policy was clear, and Mrs. Chen had to think about the other employees who managed to arrive on time. Sarah was let go on the spot. She was told to collect her things and leave the premises. She stood there in the small employee locker room, staring at her name tag, trying to process what had just happened. She'd lost one of her 2 jobs because she'd stopped to help someone who was hurt. The irony wasn't lost on her, but it didn't make the situation any less devastating. She did some quick mental math as she cleaned out her locker. Without this income, she couldn't make rent. She'd have to ask her landlord for an extension, maybe try to pick up extra shifts at the hospital, though they'd already told her they couldn't offer her more hours. She took the bus home, exhaustion and worry pressing down on her like physical weight. Maya would need to be picked up from the neighbors in a few hours. She'd have to tell her daughter something, though she wasn't sure what yet. Maya was smart enough to know when things were wrong, but Sarah didn't want to scare her. She'd always tried to shield her daughter from the worst of their financial struggles, maintaining a sense of normalcy even when things were falling apart behind the scenes. The apartment felt too quiet when she got home. She sat on the edge of her bed, still in her hospital scrubs, and allowed herself 5 minutes to just feel the weight of it all. Then she stood up, washed her face, and started looking through job listings on her phone. She couldn't afford to fall apart. That wasn't an option when you had a child depending on you. 3 days passed. Sarah had applied to 17 different positions, from nursing homes to hospitals to retail stores. She'd called in every favor she could think of, reached out to former co-workers, even swallowed her pride and posted about her situation on social media. Nothing had come through yet. Her savings account, never substantial to begin with, was down to $216. Rent was due in 5 days. On the 4th day, there was a knock at her door. She wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment she wondered if it was her landlord, coming early to discuss payment. But when she opened the door, she found a man in a dark suit holding a briefcase. He introduced himself as Robert Chen, no relation to her former supervisor, and said he was here on behalf of someone who wanted to speak with her. Sarah's first instinct was suspicion. She'd heard enough stories about scams targeting people in financial trouble, but Robert Chen handed her a business card, and when she looked at it, her confusion only deepened. The card belonged to someone named Marcus Whitmore, and the title beneath his name read Chief Executive Officer, Whitmore Holdings. She'd never heard of the company, and she had no idea why anyone from such a place would want to speak with her. Robert Chen explained that Mr. Whitmore was the man she'd helped 4 days ago. He'd been on his way to an early meeting when he'd been mugged at knife point. The attacker had fled when he heard sirens in the distance, but not before inflicting the injury Sarah had found him with. The hospital staff had told him that the quick response time, including the pressure she'd applied to slow the bleeding, had likely prevented a much more serious outcome. Mr. Whitmore wanted to thank her personally and discuss something he'd been thinking about since that morning. Sarah agreed to the meeting, though she wasn't sure what to expect. Robert Chen drove her to an office building downtown, one of those gleaming glass structures that seemed to touch the sky. They rode an elevator to the top floor, and Sarah became increasingly aware of how out of place she looked in her worn jeans and practical jacket. Robert Chen led her to a spacious office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Behind a large desk sat the man from that morning, looking considerably healthier, though still moving carefully as he stood to greet her. Marcus Whitmore was probably in his early 50s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He thanked Robert Chen, who left them alone, and then gestured for Sarah to sit. He told her his name, though she already knew it from the business card, and asked if she'd mind if he called her Sarah. She said that was fine, still uncertain about why she was here. He started by thanking her again for what she'd done. He'd been told that most people had walked past him that morning, and he'd been starting to lose consciousness when she stopped. His voice was sincere, without the performative quality she might have expected from someone in his position. Then he said something that surprised her. He'd learned what had happened to her after she'd helped him. He'd made some inquiries, wanting to know who his good Samaritan was, and he'd discovered that she'd been fired for being late that day. Sarah felt a flash of embarrassment, wondering how much he knew about her situation. But Marcus Whitmore continued before she could say anything. He said he'd been thinking about something his own father used to tell him. That character was revealed in the choices people made when there was a cost to doing the right thing. Sarah had made a choice that morning, and it had cost her. He wanted to offer her something in return, but not as charity. He was very clear about that point. This wasn't about pity or guilt. His company Whitmore Holdings owned several businesses, including a chain of senior care facilities. He'd been looking for someone to help oversee quality assurance across those facilities, someone with real experience in patient care who understood what actually mattered on the ground level. The previous person in that role had been focused entirely on numbers and efficiency metrics, and Marcus had become concerned that the human element was being lost. He'd been planning to restructure the position anyway, and meeting Sarah had crystallized what he was looking for. He offered her the job. The salary he mentioned was more than double what she'd been making at both her previous positions combined. It included health insurance, retirement benefits, and flexible hours that would allow her to be there for Maya when needed. Sarah sat very still, trying to process what she was hearing. It sounded too good to be true, and every instinct she'd developed through years of barely scraping by told her to be careful, to look for the catch. Marcus Whitmore seemed to understand her hesitation. He told her to take time to think about it, to ask any questions she needed to ask. He wasn't offering this because he felt sorry for her, he said again. He was offering it because he'd seen something in her actions that morning that told him she was exactly the kind of person he needed for this role. Someone who would stop to help even when it cost them something. Someone who understood that caring for people wasn't just a job description, but a fundamental way of being in the world. Sarah asked him how he could be sure she was qualified for such a position. She had experience as a nursing assistant, not in management or oversight. Marcus Whitmore leaned back in his chair and said that technical skills could be taught. Judgment and character couldn't. Besides, he added, she'd be working with a team who would help her learn the administrative aspects. What he needed from her was the perspective of someone who'd actually done the work, who knew what good care looked like and what obstacles prevented it from happening. They talked for over an hour. Marcus asked her about her experiences working in healthcare, what she'd seen that worked and what didn't, what she thought could be improved in how facilities operated. Sarah found herself speaking more openly than she'd intended, describing the frustrations she'd felt watching good caregivers burn out because they were overworked and undervalued, the way budget cuts always seemed to fall hardest on the people who had the least power to push back. Marcus listened carefully, taking notes occasionally, asking follow-up questions that showed he was genuinely interested in her perspective. By the time Sarah left that office, she'd accepted the position. They shook hands, and Marcus told her she could start the following Monday, which would give her time to arrange childcare and get oriented. As Robert Chen drove her home, Sarah stared out the window at the city passing by, unable to quite believe what had just happened. 4 days ago, she'd been fired. Now she had a job that would change everything for her and Maya. It felt surreal, like something that happened to other people in stories, not to single mothers struggling to keep the lights on. That evening, after she'd picked up Maya and they'd eaten dinner together, Sarah tried to explain what had happened. Maya asked if they were going to be okay now, and Sarah realized her daughter had been carrying more worry than she'd let on. She pulled Maya close and told her yes. They were going to be okay. Things were going to be different. Better. Maya asked if this meant they could get a cat, and Sarah laughed, the sound surprising her with its lightness. Maybe, she said. They'd see. The first few weeks at Whitmore Holdings were overwhelming in ways Sarah hadn't anticipated. She'd expected to feel out of her depth with the corporate environment and the administrative responsibilities, and she did. But what surprised her more was how much Marcus Whitmore seemed personally invested in making sure she succeeded. He checked in regularly, not in a micromanaging way, but with genuine interest in how she was adjusting. He introduced her to key people across the organization and made it clear to everyone that her perspective was valuable and should be taken seriously. Sarah spent her days visiting the various care facilities under the Whitmore umbrella, observing operations, talking to staff members at all levels, and taking detailed notes about what she saw. She approached the work the way she'd approached nursing, with careful attention to detail and a focus on the human beings at the center of everything. She noticed things that the previous quality assurance director had apparently missed, small details that made a significant difference in residents' daily lives. A facility that kept its common areas too cold because of budget concerns about heating costs. Staff members who were skipping their breaks because there weren't enough people scheduled to cover for them. Activities programs that existed on paper but had been quietly discontinued due to lack of funding. She compiled her observations into reports that were more detailed and more critical than anyone had expected. When she presented her first comprehensive assessment to Marcus and the senior leadership team, there was a long silence after she finished. She'd been honest about what she'd found, including some serious concerns about certain facilities that were cutting corners in ways that compromised resident care. For a moment she worried she'd overstepped, been too blunt. Maybe cost herself this job the same way her honesty had sometimes caused problems in her previous positions. But Marcus Whitmore had simply nodded and asked her what she recommended they do about each issue she'd raised. Over the next 2 hours they worked through her report point by point, with Marcus asking detailed questions and the leadership team taking notes. By the end of the meeting, Sarah had authorization to implement changes at 3 facilities immediately, with plans to address the systemic issues across the entire network. She left that conference room feeling shaken and exhilarated. Someone had actually listened to her. More than that, they were going to act on what she'd told them. The changes didn't come easily. There was resistance from some facility managers who saw Sarah as an outsider, someone who'd been handed a cushy corporate job without earning it. She heard the whispers and saw the skeptical looks when she showed up for site visits. But she kept doing the work, kept documenting what she found, kept advocating for both the residents and the frontline staff who cared for them. And slowly, things began to shift. Staff members started approaching her with concerns they'd been afraid to raise before. Residents and their families began to notice improvements in care quality. The numbers backed up what Sarah was seeing on the ground, with resident satisfaction scores rising and staff turnover beginning to decrease. Marcus continued to be a steady presence, supporting her work but never taking credit for her ideas. He seemed to understand that part of what made Sarah effective was that she'd lived the reality these frontline workers faced. She wasn't some management consultant theorizing about efficiency. She'd worked doubles back to back because there was no one else to cover a shift. She'd gone without lunch breaks to finish her patient care tasks. She'd dealt with the guilt of knowing she couldn't give residents as much time and attention as they deserved because there was always someone else who needed help right now. About 3 months into her new position, Sarah was working late in her office when Marcus stopped by. He asked if she had a minute, and she gestured for him to sit down. He'd been quiet for a moment, seeming to choose his words carefully. Then he told her something he hadn't mentioned before. His mother had spent the last year of her life in a care facility. Not one of the Whitmore facilities, this was before he'd acquired that particular business line, but a place that had come highly recommended. She'd hated it there. Not because the staff were cruel or neglectful, but because the system was designed around efficiency rather than dignity. Everything ran on a schedule that had nothing to do with what residents actually needed or wanted. His mother had been a night owl her entire life, but the facility put everyone to bed at 8:30 because that's when the night shift started and they had fewer staff members on duty. He'd visited as often as he could, but he'd also been running a company and dealing with his own family responsibilities. He'd trusted that the facility was providing good care, because that's what the metrics said. Good safety scores, clean inspection reports, acceptable medication error rates. It wasn't until after his mother died that he'd really understood what those numbers had hidden. His mother had been physically safe and medically stable, but she'd been profoundly lonely and bored and treated more like a problem to be managed than a person with preferences and dignity. That's why he'd acquired the senior care business in the first place, he told Sarah. He'd wanted to create something different, but he'd quickly realized he didn't actually know how. He'd hired people with impressive credentials and good business sense, and they'd improved the financial performance of the facilities, but something essential had still been missing. Meeting Sarah that morning had reminded him of his original purpose. She'd stopped to help a stranger at personal cost because it was the right thing to do. That was the mindset he wanted embedded in every level of the organization, and he didn't know how to make that happen through policy memos and management directives. Sarah had listened to this quietly, understanding for the first time the full weight of what he was asking of her. This wasn't just about quality assurance metrics or regulatory compliance. He was asking her to help transform an entire approach to care, to make it about honoring the humanity of every resident and every worker. It was a much bigger responsibility than she'd realized, and it scared her. But it also felt deeply right in a way few things in her life ever had. She told him about her own grandmother, who'd raised her after her parents died. Her grandmother had worked as a housekeeper her entire adult life, cleaning other people's homes and offices, never complaining about the physical toll it took on her body. When she'd gotten too old to work anymore, she'd refused to consider moving into any kind of care facility. She'd said she'd seen too many places where people were warehoused and forgotten. Sarah had taken care of her grandmother at home until the end, juggling work and caregiving in a way that had nearly broken her. She'd loved her grandmother fiercely, but she'd also resented the situation sometimes, the impossibility of it, the way there seemed to be no good options for people without significant resources. That experience had shaped everything about how Sarah viewed caregiving and elder care. She understood both sides of it, the exhaustion of family caregivers and the vulnerability of people who needed help. She wanted to create facilities that families could trust, where residents could maintain their dignity and autonomy as much as possible, where staff members were paid enough and supported enough to do their jobs well without burning out. She'd never really articulated this vision before, had never thought anyone would care about her opinions on such things. But sitting in that office with Marcus Whitmore, she found herself describing in detail what good care could look like if resources and will were aligned properly. Marcus had listened intently, and when she finished, he'd asked if she would be willing to lead a new initiative across all their facilities. Not quality assurance anymore, but something broader. A complete redesign of their care model, with her perspective at the center of it. It would mean more responsibility, more visibility, and inevitably more challenges. But it would also mean real opportunity to create the kind of change she'd been talking about. Sarah had agreed, though she'd been honest about her doubts. She still felt like an imposter sometimes, sitting in meetings with people who had advanced degrees and decades of corporate experience. But Marcus had shook his head firmly. Those credentials were valuable, he'd said, but they could also become blinders. Sarah saw things others missed because she'd lived a different reality. That wasn't a weakness. It was exactly what made her invaluable. The initiative Sarah led over the next year became something of a model in the industry. She worked with staff members at every level to develop new protocols that balanced efficiency with person-centered care. Residents were given much more control over their daily schedules. Staff members were paid better and given more training and support. Families were brought more directly into care planning. It wasn't perfect, and there were constant challenges, but the changes were real and measurable. Staff retention improved dramatically. Resident satisfaction scores reached levels the organization had never seen before. Other companies in the industry began asking questions about what Whitmore Holdings was doing differently. Through all of this, Sarah's relationship with Marcus evolved into something she hadn't expected. It remained professional, but there was a mutual respect and understanding that went deeper than typical workplace relationships. He sought her opinion on matters beyond her official role, and she found herself offering perspectives she'd never felt comfortable sharing before. They were both single parents, both carried complicated relationships with the idea of success and what it meant. Both understood what it was like to make choices where there were no good options available. Maya was thriving too. The stability that came with Sarah's new position had transformed their lives in countless small ways. They'd moved to a better apartment in a safer neighborhood with good schools. Maya had joined an after-school art program she loved. Sarah could afford fresh fruits and vegetables without calculating the cost of every item. She'd even gotten Maya that cat she'd asked for, a grey tabby they'd adopted from a shelter who now slept at the foot of Maya's bed every night. But perhaps the biggest change was internal. Sarah had spent so many years in survival mode, focused entirely on making it through each day, that she'd forgotten how to think about the future as something she could actually shape rather than just endure. Now she found herself imagining possibilities. Maybe she'd go back to school, finish the nursing degree she'd abandoned when she got pregnant with Maya. Maybe she'd develop this care model into something that could be implemented even more broadly. Maybe she could actually build something lasting that would help people beyond just her own family. One evening, nearly a year after that initial meeting in Marcus Whitmore's office, Sarah was leaving work when she ran into him in the parking garage. They'd both stayed late, which wasn't unusual for either of them. He asked if she had a moment, and they stood there between their cars talking about a facility visit she'd completed that day. The conversation drifted to other topics: their children, the challenges of single parenthood, the strange ways life could change direction when you least expected it. Marcus mentioned that his daughter was the same age as Maya and asked if Sarah might be interested in getting their kids together sometime. Maybe a weekend trip to the science museum or the zoo, something both girls would enjoy. His daughter didn't have many friends whose parents understood what it was like to juggle everything alone, and he thought it might be good for both of them. Sarah agreed, recognizing the invitation for what it was. Not romantic exactly, but an acknowledgement that their lives had become connected in ways that extended beyond the workplace. As she drove home that night, Sarah thought about the morning she'd stopped to help a bleeding stranger on her way to work. She'd lost a job that day, but she'd gained something immeasurably more valuable. Not just a better position or financial security, though those things mattered enormously. She'd gained a reminder that she was capable of more than survival, that her instinct to help, to care, to see people's humanity even when it complicated her own life, wasn't a weakness or a liability. It was exactly the quality that had opened doors she hadn't known existed. She thought about all the people who'd told her over the years that she needed to be more practical, more focused on her own needs, less willing to sacrifice for others. They'd meant well, but they'd been wrong. The choice to stop that morning hadn't been foolish or naive. It had been an expression of who she was at her core, and that choice had led her here, to a life where she could actually make a difference while also providing for her daughter. Not because someone had rescued her out of pity, but because someone had recognized something in her worth investing in. When she got home, Maya was at the kitchen table doing homework, the grey cat curled up beside her notebook. Sarah stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching her daughter, feeling the weight of gratitude settle over her like a blanket. Life was still complicated. There were still challenges ahead, still days when nothing went right, and she questioned every decision she'd made. But the baseline had shifted. They were okay, more than okay. They were building something solid. Maya looked up and smiled, asking how her day had been. Sarah sat down across from her, reaching out to scratch the cat behind its ears, and told her about her day, about the residents she'd met, and the staff members who were doing good work under difficult circumstances, and the small victories that added up over time. Maya listened with the kind of attention that reminded Sarah of why she did any of this in the first place, to show her daughter that kindness mattered, that helping others wasn't foolish, that the world could be better than it was if enough people cared enough to try. Marcus Whitmore had said once that character was revealed in the choices people made when there was a cost to doing the right thing. Sarah had made that choice on a random Tuesday morning, never imagining where it would lead. Now she understood that the choice hadn't just revealed her character. It had changed the trajectory of her entire life, and in doing so had given her the resources and platform to help change other lives too. Not as someone's charity case, but as someone whose perspective and experience had real value in the world. That difference mattered more than she could fully express. The next morning, Sarah would go back to work, back to the challenges of trying to reform systems that resisted change, back to fighting for resources and respect for the people who needed it most. But she'd do it knowing that her voice mattered, that her choices had consequences that extended far beyond her own survival. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Not a fairy tale ending, but something better. A life built on mutual respect and recognition of shared humanity. A life where helping someone could cost you everything one day and give you back more than you'd lost the next. A life that proved that sometimes the world did notice when you did the right thing. And sometimes it actually rewarded you for it in ways you never could have imagined.